Hair salons are the darkest valley. If we think toilet paper hoarding is rough, imagine the lines outside Grape Clips on May 1st. And the reference in verse 5, well, we are urged to keep our 6-foot distance from the presence of those who trouble us, using the translation from the 1979 prayer book. There's clearly a sense that all of our various vulnerabilities, from those faced by the over 60 set, which includes me, to those who have compromised immune or respiratory systems, all of those vulnerabilities point to the ominous presence of mine enemies, from the King James Version we just heard. That's the great thing about Scripture and the Psalms in particular. They can clearly tell our stories, relate our fears and uncertainties, as well as our joys and hopes, and put them all in the context of God's greater perspective on our future. But the psalmist doesn't dwell in the shadow of death. The psalmist isn't left hungry. On the contrary, the psalm begins with, I shall not want. Green pastures, still waters, a table prepared, an anointed head, and a cup that is well over half filled, one indeed that runneth over, is how the psalmist describes God's presence in times of uncertainty and threat. God's armaments, God's rod, God's staff, protect us. Well, hand washing and social distancing help too. But the suggestion, both in the middle of the psalm and at the end, is that where we are right now is not our final destination. The psalm, of course, ends with the promise that we will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. And verse 3 suggests that our soul's arrival at that destination is found in being led in paths of righteousness, not necessarily in the well-worn paths whose familiarity provides a sense of security. As we enter this time of what I'll call the new abnormal, it's hard to see out of the darkness. What most of us long for, I am hearing, is a return to the, however less dim, old normal, when people weren't hoarding toilet paper, when we could go to the gym, and travel between counties, states, or countries wasn't curtailed. Well, I suppose that we will be able to return to some of that normalcy, but as has been the case post 9/11 or post-school theater shootings, there will be changes that will affect all of us. Any major change or disruption brings those kinds of effects. And as we heard in the psalm, God sees a different ending than we can often perceive. The longing for the past is part of our human nature. The old saying, better the devil you know than the one you don't, is a clear indication of our reluctance to venture forth. But sometimes that old devil is gone for good. That was the situation in which Samuel found himself in our first reading. The Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul? I have rejected him from being king over Israel. Saul, you'll remember, was a sort of concession that God provided to calm Israel, which, comparing itself with its neighbors, both allied and hostile, felt it needed a human king. I suspect that the Israelites, recalling the strong judges it had, think Deborah or Gideon or even Samson, wanted more of the same, although with greater international influence. Despite God's and Samuel's warning that the path they wanted to follow wasn't going to lead where they expected, the people prevailed. And Saul turned out to be a disaster. Yet, despite Saul's failures and ultimate death, even Samuel wasn't immune from grieving for what had been. But God wouldn't leave Samuel or Israel comfortless. God's answer to Israel's and Samuel's longing for the past is the story we just heard. God instructed Samuel, fill your horn with oil and set out. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons. The future is there, not among Saul's heritage, but in a different place. And as a sort of exclamation point on the don't think the king will be what you expect, the story in 1 Samuel takes us to a shepherd boy, not the most handsome or most fearsome of the possibilities. The future God had in mind is not at all what Samuel expected, but it was upon David that the rest of Israel's history to the present day was built. It's clear, too, that some of the various players in our story from John's Gospel were stuck in the past. Jesus' restoration of sight for the man born blind triggered all sorts of anxieties among the bystanders. Jesus' own disciples, like so many today as well, believed that bad things were the result of bad behavior, either on the part of the man or his parents. Why, they asked, was this man born blind? Such a fate had to have been the result of someone's sin. Jesus wouldn't be sucked into such a dead-end theology. He ignored the question that focused on the past and turned attention to how God's glory might be revealed in the present moment as well as the future. The man's neighbors simply couldn't believe that an apparent congenital defect could be altered, a very understandable belief in that day. What they witnessed with their neighbor rocked their world. Understandable. Most of us have had experiences where we could never have expected something would happen, and it does. The technological advances of the last 100 years would have been unimaginable to our nation's founders. Yet we can hold the world's knowledge database in the palm of our hand. We can have Zoom meetings with participants in the next room and halfway around the world in real time. New, unfamiliar technology may be a way to refer to Jesus' making of the poultice, the spit, dirt, mud. Regardless, in the hands of Jesus, even a hardwired past can be changed. And then the Pharisees. In addition to echoing the disciples' theology of bad begotten by bad, limited amazing actions to certain times. Sabbath was not an acceptable time for healing, and this story recounted events that took place on a Sabbath, although our reading skipped that detail. And clearly the Pharisees believed that only folks they had vetted or believed worthy could do any healing. Jesus didn't fit that mold. Yet again, Jesus exploded those shackles to the past, shaking off the traditions. The way they'd always done it, however, didn't come without consequences. The man was driven out of the synagogue, and as we know, Jesus' challenging of the status quo held dire consequences for him as well. We are now found on a journey where clinging to the old paths have not and will not work. We have to trust that God will lead us on the right path. And it appears that just about every day over the last week, that path has veered in one direction or another. With every twist and turn, more voices seem to be raised in protest. Voices continue to ask, why? Fingers are pointed to the left and to the right, suggesting that the sin for COVID-19's transmission is found in one area of the world, or with one or another's government's failings. And society in general, including the church, has not been immune from pointing to the new maps demanded by the virus and saying, no, we're headed down the wrong path. The GPS says go this way, and it won't even recalculate. Recalculation of the route, however, is the way to life. As you probably heard me mention more than once, recalculation was demanded of the Jews who were carried off to Babylon when Jerusalem was destroyed in 587 BC. All of a sudden, they found themselves in a new situation where the old temple-based rituals that had become mostly formulaic, were no longer possible. As I pointed out, the exiles developed new theologies of sacrifice, giving us words we use in our Eucharistic prayer, sacrifices of praise and thanksgiving. They coupled those sacrifices with practices of prayer and study, developing the bases of synagogue worship. And when they were able to return to Jerusalem, they kept that new way of worship, which then coexisted with a restored temple worship until the temple was destroyed again. By then, however, the recalculated path that was the path of the rabbis was able to sustain them for centuries. Another example from outside the Christian tradition is found in the Quran, a development about which I was reminded the other day when my son Greg asked if I'd ever read it. He was reading a book that assumed some knowledge of the Islamic sacred text. I answered that I had read it, but not as it's generally read. Rather, my historical bent meant that I read it chronologically, that is, in the order in which the surahs or the chapters were revealed to Muhammad. Reading the book in that way gave me an insight into how Islam developed under the Prophet's leadership. It wasn't a straight path, but one that twisted and turned as conflicts and circumstances needed to be addressed. The Islam we see today is the product of many recalculations. And to be sure, many of my Muslim friends think that there need to be many more course changes. COVID-19 is demanding that we Episcopalians recalculate. The paths of righteousness we've trod for decades, at least since the developments around the 1979 prayer book, have been marked by corporate worship and a church building. The journey has usually been led by clergy, with sustenance provided by the Eucharist. And we've grown so accustomed to those patterns that the idea of anything else is very disconcerting. Yet the coronavirus has wrenched those patterns from us. It has taken us off our familiar map and into our own Babylonian exile. It has bred fear, not only of the disease itself, but of the changes in our lives it requires. Yet we are uncertain how, and perhaps a little unwilling, as Psalm 137 puts it, to sing the Lord's song in a foreign land. Like the Jews in Babylon, we are finding new ways and recovering some old ways to worship. Technology is keeping us connected when we cannot be together. And as I've heard, the fact that faces are connected with names in the gallery view of Zoom is allowing folks to put names to those faces. We're discovering that online meetings eliminate travel time to and from those meetings, and they allow for attendance by folks who might otherwise not be able to attend church. The inability to have Eucharist online has brought us back to morning prayer, a centuries-old Anglican tradition that does not require clergy, nor does it require a congregation. It can easily be done at home, individually, or in small groups. Recalculating, indeed. This Lent is unlike anything any of us have known. It is demanding much of us all. Yet, as we are assured in the psalm, God prepares the table before us. It may not be the table or preferred pasturage we're used to, but the table God prepares will feed us in ways we could never imagine. The cup God pours may indeed overflow to quench the thirst of more folks than just those gathered physically week by week. The Lord is our shepherd. He leads us in right paths for his name's sake.